Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a closer look at Supreme Court judges, sometimes called justices. Uh, these are really pivotal figures, aren't they? Their decisions basically shape the laws we all live under.
They really do. And our mission, if you like, for this deep dive is to get a handle on who these judges actually are, how they get onto that bench, and maybe the most interesting part, what their day-to-day work actually involves. We want to give you a shortcut, really, to understanding this vital bit of how government works.
Right. And it's worth saying, these top courts, they exist in lots of places. You mentioned the U.S., India, the U.K. in the source.
Yeah, Canada.
Canada, right. And while the details might change, like their specific powers or how they're set up, that core job, interpreting the Constitution, upholding the law, that seems pretty universal.
Absolutely, it's the common thread.
So let's start with the people themselves. What kind of background does someone usually need for a job like this? It's not exactly entry level, I imagine.
Definitely not. Generally speaking, you're looking at people with really deep, extensive experience in law. That might mean years practicing as a lawyer. Maybe they've already been a judge on a lower court for a good while, or sometimes they come from academia, like a top law professor.
Okay, so they've spent their careers steeped in the law.
Pretty much. They've really dedicated their professional lives to understanding how it all works, its complexities.
So they've really honed their skills over time.
Yeah.
Are there, like, specific boxes they have to tick, formal qualifications, and does that change depending on the country?
It does vary quite a bit, actually. While, a deep understanding of law is always essential, the specific rules on paper can differ. Take the U.S., for instance.
Okay.
The Constitution itself, it doesn't actually list any age or education requirements for a Supreme Court justice,
Yeah.
which is kind of surprising.
Really? No law degree required, technically.
Technically, no, but in practice, every single justice has had a law degree and usually decades of legal experience. It's all about tradition and, well, established norms there.
Right, so it's an unwritten rule, essentially. What about somewhere like India? Is it more defined there?
Yes, in India, the criteria are much more explicit. The source mentioned you need to have been a high court judge for at least 5 years, or you need to have been an advocate, basically a lawyer in a high court for 10 years or more.
Ah, okay, so that lays out a clearer path through the legal system.
Exactly. It sets clear benchmarks.
So once you have these highly qualified people, how do they actually get appointed? It's not like they run for election, is it?
No, definitely not. It's usually an appointment process. Typically, the executive branch, so the president or the prime minister nominates someone.
And then what happens? Does the nominee just start?
Not quite. That nomination then has to be approved. This often involves the legislature, like the Senate in the U.S., vetting the candidate, or sometimes there's a special judicial commission. The whole idea is to have some checks and balances to ensure the person is suitable, impartial.
Seeking balance and fairness, I guess.
That's the goal. Finding people who can weigh things fairly. And crucially, they need to be neutral, non-political.
That seems vital. Their decisions should be based purely on the law and the Constitution, right? Not swayed by personal opinions or politics.
That's the absolute ideal. Allegiance to the legal framework, not a party line.
Okay, so they're appointed, they're highly qualified. What does their job actually look like day to day? Are they in court hearing trials all the time?
Well, they do hear oral arguments for the cases they select, but a huge chunk of their work is actually reviewing appeals from lower courts. These are cases that have already been decided, but one side is challenging the outcome or the legal reasoning.
So they're dealing with cases that have worked their way up the system.
Exactly. And they get the final say. A lot of these cases involve really fundamental questions, especially around the Constitution.
Like whether a new law passed by the government is actually allowed under the Constitution.
Precisely that. Or cases where someone claims their basic rights have been violated. These constitutional cases are, a core part of their job.
Can you give us an example, a case that really shows the kind of impact these decisions can have?
Sure. A classic one from the U.S. is Brown v. Board of Education. The Supreme Court ruled that having separate schools for black and white children was unconstitutional.
Right. Ending segregation in schools.
Exactly. And that decision had a massive transformative impact on American society, on the whole civil rights movement. It really shows the power of their interpretations.
A truly landmark case. Is there a comparable example from India that the source mentioned?
Yes, the Kesavananda Bharati case. This one is huge in India. The Supreme Court essentially established something called the Basic Structure Doctrine.
Basic structure doctrine. What's that?
It means that there are certain fundamental principles at the heart of the Indian Constitution, things like democracy, secularism, the rule of law, that even Parliament can't change or amend away.
Wow. So even the lawmakers have limits set by the court's interpretation of the Constitution's core.
Exactly. It acts as a fundamental check on legislative power. And it's really shaped the whole dynamic between the courts and the government in India ever since.
So when people call these judges guardians of the Constitution,
Hmm.
it's not just a fancy title. They are actively policing the boundaries.
Very actively. They're ensuring laws and government actions stick to those core values: equality, justice, liberty, freedom of speech, all those fundamental ideas. They're not just settling disputes, they're shaping the legal DNA of the country.
Okay, so they make these incredibly important decisions. But it's not just a simple yes or no or guilty, not guilty, is it? I understand there's a lot of writing involved.
Oh, absolutely. A Supreme Court judgment isn't just a verdict, it's a detailed legal opinion. These can be long dozens, sometimes even hundreds of pages.
Hundreds of pages. What goes into all that?
Well, they lay out the facts of the case, then they meticulously explain their reasoning. They'll analyze the relevant laws, the constitutional text, maybe even the history behind a law. And crucially, they refer back to past court decisions.
Ah, so they look at how similar cases were decided before.
Exactly. That's the principle of precedent, or stare decisis, as lawyers call it, to stand by things decided. It brings consistency and predictability to the law.
So lower courts then have to follow the reasoning laid out in these Supreme Court opinions.
That's the idea. It creates a stable legal framework. Although it's worth noting, the Supreme Court can overturn its own precedents, but that's a big deal and doesn't happen lightly.
So the law can evolve, but precedent provides the main tracks. It really sounds like the words they write, these opinions, can shape the law just as much, maybe even more sometimes, than the laws passed by politicians.
In many ways, yes, their interpretations become the authoritative guide. That's why clarity, solid logic, and, a really deep understanding are so vital in those judgments.
It's an enormous amount of power, interpreting the highest law of the land. How is that power kept in check? What about responsibility?
That's a critical point. Yes, the power is immense, but it's supposed to be balanced by really strict codes of ethics. These rules are there to maintain public trust and ensure impartiality.
What kinds of ethical rules are we talking about?
Things like avoiding any conflict of interest situations where their personal interests might clash with their judicial duties. They also generally have to stay out of politics, completely nonpartisan.
And step aside from cases where they might have a personal connection.
Absolutely. That's called recusal. If they have a personal or financial stake, however small, they should step aside. Their independence is key independence from the government, from media pressure, even from public opinion. They need to be free to make the legally correct decision, even if it's unpopular.
That independence seems crucial.
Yeah.
How does their job security, their tenure, play into that? Do they serve for life?
It varies again. In some places, like India, the source mentioned they serve until a fixed retirement age, which is currently 65. But in the U.S., as many people know, Supreme Court justices have lifetime tenure. They serve until they choose to retire, pass away, or, in very rare cases, are impeached and removed.
Lifetime tenure. That really shields them from political winds, doesn't it?
That's the intention. It allows them to make tough calls, potentially unpopular ones, without worrying about losing their job. It gives them that freedom. But it also makes the initial appointment process incredibly important because that person could be shaping the law for decades.
A double-edged sword, in a way. Now, we've touched on the U.S. and India, mentioned the U.K. How much do these Supreme Court systems actually differ around the world? Is the basic model the same everywhere?
Not necessarily. While that core idea of a top court upholding the law is common, the actual structure, the powers they hold, that can look quite different from country to country.
Can you give us some examples of these differences?
Sure. The UK Supreme Court is actually quite new, relatively speaking. It was only set up in 2009. Before that, the highest court was effectively a committee within the House of Lords, the upper house of Parliament.
Really? So judges were also lawmakers?
In a sense, yes. Creating the separate Supreme Court was a big move towards a clearer separation between the judiciary and the legislature there.
Interesting. And the U.S. model with its power to strike down laws, is that typical?
The U.S. Supreme Court is generally seen as being particularly powerful, especially with its strong power of judicial review, that ability to declare laws passed by Congress unconstitutional. Not all Supreme Courts have that power to the same extent.
Right. Any other examples? France was mentioned.
Yeah, France has a body called the Constitutional Council. Does some similar things like checking if laws are constitutional,
Yeah.
often before they even go into effect. But its structure, who sits on it, and its precise role are different from the Supreme Court model in, say, the US or India. It shows there isn't just one way to handle these high level legal questions.
So the common goal is protecting the Constitution, ensuring justice. But the paths countries take to achieve that can vary quite a lot.
Exactly. The label Supreme Court judge signifies immense authority, but the exact shape and scope of that authority really depend on the specific country's legal history and political system.
Okay, so wrapping this up then. Supreme Court judges, or justices, are clearly incredibly powerful figures. They're the ultimate interpreters of a nation's constitution and laws, and their rulings ripple outwards, affecting society for years, even decades.
Definitely. And as we've seen, they usually get there through deep legal experience, they're bound by strict ethics, and ideally they operate with total independence. Their job isn't to be popular, it's to rule based on law and principle.
And for all of us, really, understanding why an independent judiciary is so important, why these judges need that protection to make fair decisions, well, it's fundamental to a free society, isn't it?
It absolutely is. It's the bedrock. Which maybe leads to a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. We've talked about how the power and structure of these courts differ globally, the US versus India versus the UK or France.
Right.
How do you think those specific differences, like lifetime tenure versus a retirement age, or stronger versus weaker judicial review, how might those structural choices actually affect the overall balance of power in a country? And maybe more importantly, how do they impact the rights we hold as individuals and the kind of society we live in? Something to think about.